You believe that finding the truth makes you a savior. You undergo a spiritual awakening, a massive paradigm-shifting epiphany, or a radical political conversion. And you look around at the messy, compromised lives of the people around you with profound pity. You think your revelation is a gift that must be shared. You do not realize that absolute belief is the most destructive weapon in the human arsenal. When you convince yourself that you possess the singular, uncorrupted truth of the universe, you stop viewing other people as individuals. You view them as hostages to ignorance. Your empathy rots, replaced by a terrifying, sterile righteousness. You will gladly burn down a perfectly functional society, destroy your family, and bankrupt your empire, all under the delusion that the ashes will somehow align with your hallucination. Notice how quickly the language shifts once someone crosses into this state. People stop describing themselves as believing something and start describing themselves as seeing it, as though the belief has upgraded from opinion to perception. That linguistic shift is not a small detail. Perception feels involuntary and undeniable in a way that opinion never does. Once someone starts talking about their conviction as something they simply see, rather than something they've concluded, disagreement stops registering to them as a competing argument. It starts registering as a kind of blindness in the person disagreeing, which is precisely the frame that let Akhenaten read Rib Hada's dying pleas as background noise, rather than an emergency. You are not a prophet, you are a biological arsonist. The specific danger here rarely announces itself as fanaticism, which is exactly what makes it so hard to catch in the mirror. It arrives dressed as clarity. Every convert to a totalizing belief describes the same sensation, the sudden, overwhelming relief of finally seeing the world correctly, after years of what they now retroactively describe as confusion. That relief feels like evidence. It is not evidence of anything except how good certainty feels after a period of doubt. And that feeling has never once been a reliable indicator of whether the certainty is actually warranted. There is a specific reason this transformation happens so fast and feels so complete once it starts. A mind under genuine uncertainty is doing constant, exhausting work, weighing conflicting information, tolerating the discomfort of not having a final answer, holding multiple possibilities open at once. A single, total belief system removes all of that labor in one motion. Every future question already has a pre-approved answer. Every ambiguous situation gets sorted instantly into believer or heretic, awake or asleep, light or darkness. The appeal isn't really about the specific content of the revelation. It's about the sheer psychological relief of never having to sit with doubt again. And that relief is intoxicating enough to override almost anything standing in its way, including the people who loved you before it arrived. 14 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Egyptian Empire was an unstoppable apex predator, built on a deeply pragmatic, chaotic, and highly functional polytheism. The gods were everywhere, and they were flexible. If Egypt conquered a neighboring kingdom, they didn't wipe out the local deities, they simply absorbed them into the pantheon. This spiritual elasticity was the ultimate political glue. It allowed a massive, diverse empire to function. At the center of this web sat the priesthood of Amun in Thebes. They were not just religious figures. They were the central bank, the supreme court, and the deep state. They owned massive estates, controlled the grain, and possessed leverage that rivaled the pharaoh himself. Understand exactly what kind of institutional weight Akhenaten was actually walking into before he ever picked a fight with it. The temple estates of Amun controlled agricultural land across the kingdom, employed a bureaucracy of scribes and administrators that rivaled the royal court in size, and had spent centuries accumulating the kind of quiet, distributed influence that no single decree could easily dislodge. This wasn't a small religious faction Akhenaten was up against. It was arguably the single most entrenched power center in the entire civilization, and he set out to dismantle it, not through gradual reform or careful negotiation, but through total, immediate erasure, as though the accumulated weight of 1,000 years could simply be chiseled away in a single reign. The reign before this story begins deserves a moment of its own, because the wealth and stability Akhenaten inherited was not a given. His father, Amenhotep III, had presided over what many historians consider the peak of Egyptian prosperity, a period of massive building projects, extensive diplomatic marriage alliances with foreign kingdoms, and a treasury so full that the surviving records of tribute and trade read almost like fiction. The system Akhenaten would eventually tear apart was not fragile or failing. It was, by nearly every available measure, working better than it ever had. The machine was messy, it was corrupt, it was decentralized, and it worked perfectly. Then Amenhotep IV inherited the throne. He looked at the sprawling, noisy, politically complex reality of his empire, and he felt absolute disgust. He did not want to manage the machine. He wanted to own the cosmos. He looked up into the blazing Egyptian sky and fixated on a single, uncompromising object, the Aten, the solar disk, the raw, radiating power of the sun itself. He didn't just adopt a new patron god. He experienced the fatal disease of the visionary. He decided that the Aten was not just the highest god, but the only god. He changed his name to Akhenaten. He declared that all other gods were a lie. Picture the sheer arrogance required to look at a civilization that has functioned for over 1,000 years, a civilization that built the pyramids and mapped the stars, and tell them that every single thing they believe is a hallucination, except for the one specific light you happen to be staring at right now. Akhenaten unleashed a campaign of spiritual butchery. He sent armies of stonemasons across the entire continent with a single terrifying order: erase the old reality. They climbed the ancient obelisks, infiltrated the sacred tombs, and brutally chiseled the name of Amen off the walls. He didn't just ban the worship of the old gods. He attempted to surgically remove their existence from the memory of the human race. Even the word Amen, buried inside other unrelated words and names throughout the kingdom, was hunted down and chiseled out wherever it appeared, sometimes destroying inscriptions that had nothing to do with the god at all, purely because the syllables matched. That level of obsessive, indiscriminate erasure tells you something important about the actual psychological state driving it. This wasn't calculated statecraft aimed at consolidating power efficiently. It was closer to a compulsion, a mind that had lost the ability to tolerate even the accidental, meaningless presence of the thing it had decided to hate. Consider how much labor this actually required, spread across an empire the size of Egypt, over years, by men who had to physically climb monuments and grind stone by hand under the desert sun. This wasn't a decree issued and forgotten. It was a sustained, expensive national campaign, diverting real resources, real labor, and real time away from everything else the kingdom needed, purely to satisfy the psychological need of one man to see his own certainty reflected back at him from every wall in the country. The cost of the erasure campaign alone, quite apart from the abandoned city that came after it, represents a staggering transfer of a functioning empire's resources into the maintenance of a single person's revelation. But erasing the past was not enough. The visionary always requires a blank canvas to paint their utopia. Thebes, with its ancient temples and stubborn priests, was too polluted by history. Akhenaten abandoned the capital. He dragged his entire court, his bureaucracy, and tens of thousands of laborers into the absolute center of a desolate, scorching desert wasteland. A place where nothing had ever been built and nothing had ever lived. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was a geopolitical suicide pact masquerading as a holy city. He forced an entire aristocracy to leave a lush, wealthy metropolis on the Nile, to live in a sterilized, artificial compound baked by the merciless sun, simply because the geography aligned with his personal epiphany. He built massive, open-air temples with no roofs, forcing his followers to worship under the blinding, skin-blistering radiation of the sun, entirely exposed to the elements. Boundary markers survive to this day, carved into the cliffs surrounding the site, recording Akhenaten's own oath never to expand the city beyond the specific borders the Aten had supposedly revealed to him. He wasn't simply moving his capital for practical or strategic reasons the way other pharaohs occasionally did. He was building a permanent, geographically fixed monument to a single afternoon of personal revelation, swearing an oath that bound an entire nation's administrative center to the coordinates of his own vision, regardless of what the empire beyond those cliffs actually needed from him. He was not building a capital. He was building an architectural echo chamber to validate his own ego. While the pharaoh was busy writing beautiful, poetic hymns to the sun, the real world began to hemorrhage. In the ruins of Amarna, archaeologists discovered one of the most agonizing archives in human history, the Amarna letters. These are the desperate, frantic diplomatic dispatches sent from the governors and vassal kings stationed at the borders of the Egyptian empire. The Hittites were invading. The alliances were crumbling. The frontier cities were being besieged and slaughtered. Read the letters, and you can hear the panic pressed into the clay. Ribhada, the loyal mayor of Byblus, wrote to Akhenaten dozens of times, begging for just a few archers, a single battalion, anything to stop the slaughter of his people. He was dying in the mud, holding the line for an empire he believed in. Akhenaten left him to die. What makes Ribhada's letters specifically devastating, reading them now, is the escalating tone across the correspondence. The early letters are formal, respectful, following every diplomatic convention expected of a vassal addressing his king. The later ones grow increasingly desperate, then bitter, then almost accusatory, as it becomes clear to a man watching his own city starve that no response is ever coming. He was not writing into a void by accident. He was writing to a specific person who had simply stopped being reachable by anything outside his own revelation. He was not the only one. The archive contains dozens of similar voices, vassal kings and regional governors across the empire's northern frontier, each one describing a version of the same collapse. Cities cut off from supply, alliances breaking down as neighboring rulers concluded that Egyptian protection had become a fiction, populations abandoning loyalty to a crown that had visibly abandoned them first. Read enough of these letters back to back, and a pattern emerges that is almost unbearable in its consistency. Competent, loyal men doing everything correctly by the old rules of the system, watching those rules stop mattering because the one person with the authority to act on their reports had simply stopped reading them as urgent. The pharaoh did not send troops. He did not send gold. He completely ignored the screams of his own empire because geopolitical warfare did not fit into his absolute, sterilized vision of reality. He was so completely intoxicated by his own spiritual purity that he allowed the greatest military superpower on Earth to be dismantled by barbarians. When you believe you have a direct line to the universe, the suffering of ordinary men looks like a distraction. You dismiss the blood of your allies as a trivial inconvenience. Akhenaten died. The illusion evaporated before his corpse was even cold. The human immune system is designed to reject a parasite, and history operates the exact same way. The moment the tyrant's lungs stopped pulling in air, the entire civilization snapped back to reality. The courtiers, the soldiers, and the laborers looked around at the barren, scorching wasteland they had been forced to live in, and they packed their bags. They abandoned the utopian city to the jackals. They returned to Thebes. They restored the priesthood of Amun. They resurrected the old gods. Then they executed the ultimate vengeance upon the visionary. They did to him exactly what he had done to the world. They sent the stonemasons back out. They chiseled Akhenaten's face off his own statues. They scratched his name out of the king lists. They dismantled his sun temples stone by stone and used the rubble as the hidden foundations for the new temples of Amun. There is something almost too fitting about that last detail. The stones that once declared him the sole channel to divine truth ended up buried, face down, holding up the exact religious system he had tried to erase, his own monument to himself, becoming, quite literally, the foundation for his enemies. He didn't just lose the argument. His entire physical legacy was repurposed as evidence for the other side. They turned the man who thought he was the sole conduit of the universe into a nameless ghost. For over 3,000 years afterward, no one even knew his name. He simply doesn't appear on the official king lists later pharaohs compiled, an erasure so complete that Akhenaten wasn't rediscovered by history until the 19th century, pieced back together entirely from the wreckage he left behind. It's worth sitting with the scale of that irony one more time before moving on. A man who spent his reign trying to become the single permanent source of all meaning in his civilization ended up as the single most thoroughly deleted figure in that civilization's official memory. The erasure he perfected against Amun became, almost immediately after his death, the exact tool used against him. History does not reliably punish every tyrant this precisely. It punished this one with a symmetry that reads less like coincidence and more like a lesson written in stone by the very people he'd spent his life trying to silence. Look at the visionaries actively destroying your life right now. Look at the tech founder who inherits a massively profitable, functional core business. The machine is printing money. The employees are secure. But the founder gets bored. They go to a retreat, experience a hallucination of the future, and return completely radicalized. They decide the company must pivot entirely into an unproven, abstract utopian vision. A metaverse, a decentralized web, a proprietary AI god. They shut down the profitable divisions. They fire the pragmatists who dare to ask how this will make money. They burn billions of dollars of runway building and architectural echo chamber in the desert, forcing the entire staff to worship their new obsession. While the competitors invade their market share and the core product rots, the founder sits in a glass office, writing poetic manifestos on social media, completely deaf to the screams of the shareholders and the employees losing their livelihoods. Notice the specific detail that makes this pattern so recognizable once you've seen it once. The founder rarely frames the pivot as a business decision at all. Even when framing it that way would actually be more honest. It gets described in the language of revelation, seeing clearly for the first time. The old way was never going to work. Everyone's still doing things the old way, just hasn't woken up yet. That vocabulary is not incidental. It's doing the exact same work Akhenaten's hymns to the Aten were doing 3,000 years earlier, converting an ordinary, testable business hypothesis into an article of faith that anyone questioning it is simply too unenlightened to understand. Look at the romantic partner who discovers a new extreme diet, a radical political ideology, or a fringe spiritual movement. They don't just practice it, they weaponize it. They look at your life, the messy, normal, functional polytheism of your hobbies, your friends, your habits, and declare it toxic. They demand absolute ideological alignment. They force you to chisel the names of your old friends out of your life. They drag you into their barren, sterile desert of purity, where every conversation is a loyalty test to their new god. The mechanism here follows the exact same shape as the campaign against Amun, just scaled down to the size of a household. It starts with framing your existing relationships aren't simply different from the new belief. They're actively contaminated by the old way of seeing things. Then it moves to erasure. Specific people, specific habits, specific sources of joy get systematically removed, one at a time. Each removal justified as a necessary step toward purity. What looks, from the outside, like a series of separate arguments about individual friends or hobbies is usually, underneath, a single sustained campaign to hollow out every competing source of meaning in your life until the new belief system is the only structure left standing. There's a smaller, quieter version of this same pattern worth naming too, because it doesn't require a founder's runway or a partner's ultimatum to do damage. Someone reads a single book, watches a single documentary, or has a single intense conversation, and within days rebuilds their entire worldview around it, treating everyone who hasn't had the same revelation as somehow less awake than they now are. They don't necessarily destroy an empire. They just quietly alienate their oldest friends, one increasingly tedious conversation at a time, convinced the friction they're causing is simply the sound of ignorance resisting enlightenment. If you do not submit, you are branded a heretic. Absolute belief is not a sign of high intelligence. It is the signature of a coward who cannot handle the terrifying, chaotic ambiguity of real life. There's a difference worth drawing carefully here, though, because this lesson can curdle into something lazy if it's used to dismiss every strongly held conviction as a symptom of the same disease. Genuine conviction, arrived at slowly, tested against real disagreement, and held with enough humility to update when the evidence demands it, is not the same thing as what destroyed Akhenaten's empire. The test isn't whether someone believes something strongly. Plenty of people hold deep convictions and remain fully capable of hearing Ribhada's letters, so to speak, without letting the conviction override their basic obligations to the people depending on them. The actual marker of the trap is whether the belief has become load-bearing for the believer's entire identity, to the point where any competing information, however urgent, simply cannot register as real. Akhenaten's failure was never that he had a religious idea. It was that the idea became a wall nothing else could get through, including a burning empire. There's a practical test worth applying to your own convictions, and to the convictions of anyone trying to pull you into theirs, before deciding which category a given belief actually falls into. Ask what specific piece of evidence, if it arrived tomorrow, would be allowed to change the believer's mind. If a real, honest answer exists, even a difficult one, even one that seems unlikely to occur, the conviction is still operating inside the normal architecture of a mind that can be corrected. If the honest answer is that nothing, structurally, could ever be allowed to count as disconfirming evidence, because any counter-evidence would simply be reinterpreted as further proof of the conspiracy or the ignorance of everyone still resisting, you are looking at Akhenaten's desert, whether the person standing in it knows the name or not. The world is not meant to be a single blinding light. It is meant to be a messy, loud, complicated bazaar where thousands of different forces negotiate for space. Every civilization that has ever tried to run itself on a single, unquestionable truth has eventually discovered the same thing Egypt discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten. The bazaar wins. It always wins, not because chaos is virtuous, but because a system built from many competing, negotiating parts can absorb a shock that a system built around one fixed sun cannot. Kill the one true believer at the center, and the bazaar simply reroutes around the gap. Kill the bazaar, and there is nothing left standing once the light at the center inevitably goes out. When a visionary walks into your life, points at the sun, and demands that you burn down your house to follow them into the desert, don't pack your bags. Don't argue with their theology, because arguing only confirms for them that you're exactly the kind of unenlightened obstacle their revelation warned them about. Hand them a canteen, point them toward the sand, and let the desert do what deserts have always done to men who mistook their own reflection for the sun.